We've got tons more leaks, rumors, and actual news regarding upcoming GPUs, more about AMD GPUs, more about the 50 series from Nvidia, all sorts of stuff going on here. Laptops, we've got upcoming CPUs, motherboards, little software updates, some cool stuff I've seen regarding a whole bunch. You know what, let's just dive in here, guys. Also, man, I wasn't kidding in my last video when I said my kids gave me the flu for Christmas. We're now recovering enough to have some voice and energy to try to get through some PC hardware news. Let's do this. Let's start out with the AMD GPU rumors. We've got Zhang Zhao. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation here, but we've seen him posting on the Chip Hell forums before. I've used Google Chrome to translate this into English. This defaults, this is Chinese language. This is our, Lakers with Jensen on top leaker we've got here. And again, has had a track record of showing some sort of insider information within the supply chain on AMD parts in the past, talking about the next generation of AMD graphics card, which we've seen in previous leaks might end up being called the 9070 XT, which would be an interesting change to the naming scheme. Now, he's mentioning that the public version of TBP 26X, some non-public versions have reached 330 watts. Again, there's some translation differences going on here, but what we're essentially seeing is that this is, by 26X, I think he means 260 something watts, because we're talking about TBP, total board power, and saying non-public versions have reached 330 watts. By public version, I think what we mean here is reference design. So the AMD reference design for this card could be a 260 something watt part, but the AIB manufacturers who are allowed to push things harder with factory overclocks and things like that apparently might go as high as 330 watts. Now, that's a lot of watts. That would indicate that this is potentially a pretty, beefy card, which would then maybe make the time spy scores that were leaked that I discussed in my last video come a bit into question. And he actually gets question about that and replies right here, where he gets the question, is the performance the same as the leaked time spy 22,000-ish score? He says, I don't have any benchmarks, specifically meaning time spy benchmarks. I only know the game tests, and there is not much difference from a 4080, within 5%. Now, if we jump over to Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart, that gives a very different picture than what those leaked time spy scores were presenting, where the leaked time spy scores put it roughly in line with the 7900 GRE. Whereas if it's closer to being in line with an RTX 4080, that's more similar to 7900 XTX. That's a totally different class of GPU. Now, is this guy's information any better than the leaked time spy scores? Well, as I mentioned in that video about the time spy scores, that kind of thing is very easy to just Photoshop or just completely make up. So it's difficult to put much stock into that. Also, I've seen people following up in comments on that saying that usually leaked time spy scores at this point wouldn't be reporting the actual GPU name as its full name, and they're calling even more question into those leaked time spy scores. So anyway, this is certainly more in line with the earlier rumors we'd seen as far as gaming performance targets go. So I would certainly find this GPU to be a lot more exciting if it's coming in, closer to, that 4080, 7900 XTX type of performance, but hopefully at a much more exciting price. Really, any of these performance numbers and whatnot are only exciting in the context of price. And so until we know what this costs, it's hard to get excited one way or the other about it. Anyway, as far as this goes, again, he's just talking about confirming that he's expecting it to be within 5% of an RTX 4080. All right, so that's what we have in updates here. Now, do we trust Zhang Gao any better than any, the previous leaks? Guys, these are leaks and rumors. They're fun to talk about, but I wouldn't put way too much stock in any of these. We're expecting a full reveal in CES in January. It's coming soon, so we can have some fun speculation. But anyway, like I said, we'll find out everything soon enough. Now, we also have Copite 7 Kimmy dropping in some Merry Christmas information about the 5070 Ti and 5070, confirming the leaked specs. Now, again, as leaks and rumors go, always take them with a grain of salt. However, Copite 7 Kimmy is one of our best sources as far as proven track records go. Saying that the 5070 Ti, basically confirming what we'd expect as far as a 16 gigabyte GDDR7 graphics card on a 256-bit bus at 300 watts. This is pretty in line with what we've been seeing in the previous leaks. And the 5070, again, kind of the most useful information here is confirming that it's a 12 gigabyte GDDR7 card at 250 watts on a 192-bit bus. And then if you look into the numbers here, it's basically talking about the core count. Now, the reason I pulled up the videocards.com article for this is they have helpfully given us this chart here. By the way, all my sources will be linked in the video description if you want to dive in more detail to peruse at your leisure. Anyway, what I like here is this gives us a direct comparison of the 5070 Ti specs versus the 4070 Ti and the 5070 specs versus the 4070 specs. So here, it's showing that the 5070 Ti here is looking like it's an increase of 15 watts to the power consumption, which is a 5% increase, whereas the core count has gone up 16.7%, and the memory capacity has gone up 4 gigabytes. Because remember, the original 4070 Ti was a 12 gigabyte card. It got replaced by the 4070 Ti Super that was a 16 gigabyte card, but the original 4070 Ti was only 12. The memory clocks are going up 7 gigabits per second, which is a 33% increase, and that means the total bandwidth would be increasing by 77%, which is an increase of 392 gigabytes per second. Now, what all of that combines to in actual real-world gaming performance gains, we'll have to see in actual benchmarks. Because again, it's not going to be as simple as any one of these numbers, right? Depending on the game and exactly what you're doing, all of those things can be, bottlenecks. And so we'll have to see what ends up coming of that. Now, the 5070 versus 4070, here we're seeing no memory capacity upgrade. It's still 12 gigabytes. The cores are only a 4% increase, so we're already seeing a much more modest increase in that here, although because of the move to GDDR7, it does mean that you're getting the increase of 7 gigabits per second, giving a total bandwidth increase of 33.3%, which would be plus 168 gigabytes per second. But that looks like it's coming at a power consumption penalty of an increase of 50 watts. That's 25% increase. Again, we don't know exactly what that would mean in terms of gaming performance gains, but I think a lot of people were hoping to see the 5070 come with more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM and, hopefully, a decent performance gain. So it's looking like if you were going to be in gaming scenarios that were memory bandwidth constrained, then maybe you're seeing a reasonable performance jump, but in stuff that was more constrained by cores or you're spilling over 12 gigabytes of VRAM, this isn't really going to solve those problems. So that's what we have in the latest leaks and rumors on that, coming from Copite 7 Kimmy. Now, the other thing to note on these power numbers is this isn't specifying whether it's TBP or TGP or TDP or any of that. So maybe we should dive into that just a little bit because there's a difference between the TGP and the TDP. TDP is the thermal design power. That's more talking usually, I think, about what the actual graphics chip itself would be using, but not what the entire board would be using. And sometimes those numbers get kind of mixed up or it's unclear which one you're talking about in leaks. For total board power, AMD tends to use TBP, total board power, which is like what we're seeing talked about here. Whereas Nvidia, I think, seems to prefer TGP, the total graphics power, talking about the whole graphics subsystem, meaning the entire board. Whereas, like I said, the TDP is more, I think, talking about the thermal design limit in real-world use cases for the actual graphics chip rather than the entire board. Anyway, so sometimes when we're talking power limits, there's some confusion on that in the leaks leading up. However, speaking of leaks, we are getting actual pictures of the 5090, at least a qualification sample of the 5090. Now, a qualification sample generally means it's not supposed to be used for actual performance testing or for, and you wouldn't sell this, but it's more used for the AIB, AIC partners for testing and verification that everything's up and running. And that is also confirmed right here by the source of this leak, which is BenchLife. Anyway, I'm not sure we learned too much here other than it does indeed look like 16 RAM modules, which would likely be 32 gigabytes total, of expecting it to be GDDR7. We look at some other pictures of the board, which also seem to indicate that it's using the PCIe Gen 5 connectors and all of that. They're also saying that it's looking like they have some additional information about power phases and PCB layers being 14 and all that. But really, I don't think we get a lot that's like super interesting about this. It's just like these are definitely out there. And we should get more information soon. Speaking of them being out there and getting ready to go, we do have the box for an RTX 5080 from Galax out there. This is coming from videocards.com. And they say that they have reached out to private contacts within Galax to confirm that this is legitimate and that their source did confirm that this is actually Galax's 5080 box art. Now, while there's not a lot new to learn from this, that's actually the main new thing that we can learn. Videocards.com tried to upscale this and couldn't actually read any of the text, but when comparing it to the 4080's box, this is the Galax 4080, what they note is that there doesn't seem to be any mention of additional new features. So we had talked about the fact that we might expect some kind of neural rendering being a big talking point at CES for the RTX 50 series. That doesn't seem to be mentioned on the box art for the 5080. Nothing new there. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be new neural rendering stuff being talked about at CES, but maybe that's not going to be listed on the box as a new selling point. Does that mean that it's not going to be exclusive to the 50 series? That would be nice, at least, you know, if NVIDIA is not, you know, locking things to the newer generations if they have new stuff. Excuse me, guys. Still battling that flu. Anyway, but speaking of all of this, trying to get all of these out there, it's being reported that both Nvidia and AMD are in a rush to get as much next-gen GPU supply into the United States to avoid potential tariffs. Because again, although none of the tariff policy you know, has actually taken place yet, the discussion is that Trump could possibly implement large tariffs. There have been statements made about a 10% tariff to just basically anything coming from anywhere, but up to 60% tariffs coming of supplies, you know, parts coming in from China. So that's where we're getting these estimated costs of $2,500 plus for a 5090. But I'm going to say that that's just, you know, that's speculation based on we don't know exactly what the tariffs will be, and we also don't know what the baseline price of the 5090 would be. So I wouldn't read too much into those types of headlines giving specific numbers, but in general, we still have that kind of looming thing over our heads. However, like it said, if we get enough supply into the country for at least the initial launch, then maybe it'll be affecting prices later on, depending on what happens with the tariffs, but might not at least affect the initial MSRP and supply, but maybe kind of hit later once they have to start bringing stuff in from out of the country once if tariffs do end up coming into place. A lot of people want to know exactly what's going to go on with this, but the truth is we really just don't. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with the tariff situation yet. Now, we do see Clevo X580 laptop with a Core Ultra 200HX and an RTX 50 GPU showing up on Geekbench. However, it's not a very useful test for gaming scenarios. We're seeing an AI test, which is, again, not applicable to anything I would really care about on this channel. So, meh. But anyway, it does mean that they're at least kind of out there and getting tested, but it would have been cool if we had something a little more gaming applicable. And it's the same thing I'll say for the Geekbench results that we're seeing leaked for a 16-core Ryzen 9000HX Fire Range CPU and a Ryzen 990 950X 3D CPU. But again, it's a Geekbench AI test, which doesn't really tell us anything useful about gaming. So anyway, that's there. You can follow those up, again, following the links in the video description if you'd like. What I am more interested in with the 9950X3D is that the CPU Z specs have been screenshot, and this confirms a couple of things, some good, some bad. What you're basically getting out of this is that the cache configuration is not what we had hoped. There's been some kind of spoilers on the level 3 cache. Initially some people had hoped that both CCDs, because on these 16 core parts, in the previous generation, like with the 7950X3D, you had one CCD with the 3D cache and one without. There had been some rumors to maybe have the 9000 series, the 9950X3D, have the 3D cache on both CCDs. But this, if it's legitimate, seems to be confirming that it will only be on one CCD, not on both. So, similar configuration to what we saw in previous generations. It's also important to note, excuse me, that this is an AMD engineering sample. So, it's not the full retail version, but at least on this engineering sample and configured, however it is configured here, it does seem to be indicating a max TDP of 170 watts, which I believe is the same as the non-3D cache part, which is a difference from the 7000 series, where the 3D cache parts had a lower TDP than the non-3D cache parts and also had lower clocks. However, when you look at the multipliers here, stating 6.0 to 56.5, that does seem to indicate the clock speeds matching the non-3D Vcache part. And that's where you get headlines like this, showing max 5.65 gigahertz clock, 170 watt TDP, and single 3D Vcache CCD. Anyway, we'll have to see what comes of that when we actually get it. And it is also looking like we will be very soon getting the lower-end motherboards from both AMD and Intel, with AMD's B850 and B840 motherboards launching on January 15th, and Intel's B860 and H810 on January 13th. Can I just mention that I kind of hate the fact that AMD and Intel motherboards, like B860 and B850, one of those being AMD and one of those being Intel, is really annoying for the, I think, especially people who are less just totally into the PC hardware space and just trying to put together a build. I think that's kind of confusing. I wish they didn't use such similar naming schemes. Anyway, that's a little bit of a pet peeve. This is not official from AMD or Intel. This is coming from board channels, and I found it on videocards.com. But board channels does tend to have accurate leaks on this type of thing, with sources from within the board partners and supply chains and all of that. Now, it's looking like, as reported in a previous hardware news video, the Nvidia app had been confirmed to reduce gaming performance, but through testing at Hardware Unboxed, it had been narrowed down to the game filters option. So it looks like Nvidia has resolved this issue by a driver hotfix that disables the game filter option by default, which fixes the performance issues unless you then choose to enable the game filters. So I think that's right to have them default to off, since there's a performance cost, and then you can turn that on manually if you'd like, with the understanding that that can have a performance impact in some games. In Intel software news, it looks like their studio video recording and streaming features that were built into their driver software is being retired in the new version of their graphics software. So that feature had been available in the older version, but in the newer version is no longer available, and a user asking about that did get a reply from an Intel representative stating that Intel has made the tough decision to retire the studio page and its feature for now in our graphics software. The reason behind this decision is the features within the studio page had very low user usage, and many features within the studio page are supported by great third-party software today like OBS, Steam, Windows Game Bar, etc. Don't use Windows Game Bar, guys. Anyway, we may consider bringing back these features in the future if demand is high. So basically they're saying, hey, just use OBS. That's what everybody else is doing. Anyway, but it is kind of unfortunate to see losing some software support that they had previously rather than expanding it. But, I guess with Intel's revenue or financial situation where it is, if they're cutting things but keeping the graphics division going, I'm all for cutting the maybe unnecessary bits to keep everything else going. I'd like everything to keep going. So anyway, that is what it is. Now, I thought this was pretty interesting. So Neo makes handheld gaming PCs, and this looks like a really interesting design. So the idea is to have modular controls with different options available that are extremely customizable that you could then slot in as needed for whatever game or style that you want to play. So that looks really cool. I think that's a neat design. I think that their high-end models from Neo tend to not be inexpensive. So that will probably be the caveat on this. But anyway, I think that looks like a pretty interesting design. Now, speaking of interesting customizations, over at Blurbusters, they're talking about a CRT simulation in a GPU shader that looks better than black frame insertion. Now, I don't want to go way into the weeds on this in the middle of a hardware news video, but for those of you interested in reducing motion blur on displays, many people are aware of black frame insertion, where you kind of alternate a black frame in between like if you have 60 hertz content on a 120 hertz display, flashing in a black screen every other frame can actually help the perception of motion fluidity due to, I think, a reduction in persistence blur. However, there are also some issues with that. The idea here is to simulate more of how how old CRTs worked, where you have the CRT scan going down with some kind of fading in between. And apparently this looks better than BFI. Now, I haven't had a lot of time to play around with this myself because this is more of a software they were announcing, which had not been updated into any actual like they had demos of it, but you couldn't really use it in actual software. However, this has been updated, that it got added to RetroArch emulator on GitHub quickly the same day they released this post. And the next public release of RetroArch will include the CRT beam simulator mode as a setting. So basically, I've just looked at their simulation videos that they've done here. Now, these need to run on a high refresh rate display. And since this video I'm filming right now is being captured at 60 hertz and displayed at 60 hertz on YouTube, I'm not going to go ahead and try to show you any of these. But if you're on a high refresh rate display, if you follow this link and use the one that matches your monitor's refresh rate, you can get an idea of a side-by-side what this looks like and how it can reduce the motion blur. It's certainly an interesting idea, and it's one of the downsides of having moved away from CRTs. CRT motion fluidity looked a lot better than what we tend to get on LCDs and even OLEDs. But anyway, let's go ahead and move along to Valve reveals what games made the most money on Steam in 2024. And I found this pretty interesting. First of all, the 12 games that made the most money on Steam, and now they're not saying in any particular order, so don't necessarily take it as Counter-Strike 2 was number 1, but these are the top 12. You'll notice that many of these were not released in 2024. Kind of interesting. And if you move to the only games that released in 2024 sections, one thing that really stood out here to me was Manor Lords. Look at that, coming in the top 12 on overall revenue. But another thing that coming out of the Steam stats on all of this stuff was generally interesting to me, how few people were actually playing 2024 releases, which makes a lot of sense if you look at the Steam hardware survey and a lot of people are on older graphics cards. A lot of people are having a blast playing older games or esports titles, competitive games, things like that, which don't require beefy hardware, which is why, if you're building a PC to play the latest single-player, AAA games at the highest graphics settings on 4K, maybe, yeah, your PC needs to be thousands of dollars. But if you just want to enjoy PC gaming and have a wide variety of games to play, it doesn't necessarily mean you need a crazy powerful PC in order to enjoy that. All right, that is the news I've got for you guys today. Hopefully I wasn't in too much brain fog today and this all made sense. I'm gonna go ahead and rest my voice now a little bit, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.